Right, here we go. So, I gladly agreed to take this service for Erin while she's away. And then I found out that I would be preaching on the prodigal son. And I went to the Garden of Gethsemane and I said, Father, if this cup could be removed from my lips. But it couldn't, so here I am. And I think I'm going to start a society for the consolation of people whose sympathies lie with the older brother. So this is perhaps the most popular and certainly one of the best known of Jesus' parables. And perhaps because of this, there is a really standard interpretation of it, which reaches back hundreds, maybe 1,000 years. And the traditional interpretation works as a simple allegory. God is the Father who allows us through free will to sin. We are like the prodigal son, prone to sin, but in the end realizing our need to go home to God, to repent and change our lives. And because God is forgiving, we are received back with grace and we live happily ever in that grace after. Now, what should maybe alert us to the fact that this isn't a very good or very complete reading of this parable is the absence in it of any mention of the older brother, who does everything he's asked, all the time, and in the end is left outside of the family unit nearly completely. He is generally, in this traditional interpretation of the parable, condemned for what is considered to be his terrible, judgmental, and unforgiving attitude, but I honestly wonder if that's just because we've gotten so used to the idea that the story is really about the younger son and his epic bender. I wonder if there's something more to the story, and if the focus shouldn't be perhaps on the predicament that the older brother finds himself in because of the actions of two other members of his family. So let's look at that story again. A man has two sons. In this context, at this point in Jewish cultural history, money is a resource shared amongst the family. However, it technically belongs to the father until his death. This means that when the younger son approaches him and demands his share of the inheritance, he is committing several simultaneous cultural crimes. He is telling his father basically that he feels he would be better off if his father died and he had his father's money instead. He is also putting his own interests ahead not only of his father's, but of his whole family's. The basic message is, I am way better off without you losers. And for reasons that are not clear to us, but might involve some overly permissive parenting, although in technical terms, the younger brother has the right to this request, the father, risking social condemnation, gives the younger son exactly what he asks for. We know what happens after this. The younger son spends all the money in loose living. But he does worse than this. He spends it in places away from his home culture, in ways that his culture finds utterly unacceptable and reprehensible. He does what the prophets of the Old Testament warn against doing. He mixes with strange people who have appallingly bad habits that run counter to everything he has been brought up to believe is good and right and respectful and God-fearing. He has rejected not only his family, but his entire people. We know this because when he is finally destitute in a foreign land, the only work he can find is as a swineherd, a person who serves what his people consider the most unclean animals. He is become an abomination. At this point, the text says, he comes to himself. It's not clear exactly what this means, and it's often interpreted as a moment of repentance, but in fact all we truly know is that the young man, who thus far has only thought of his own comforts, realizes that these comforts would be better served by going home than staying where he is. So basically the menu is better at home, even if he's not taken back as a family member. The fact that it took him this long to work that out doesn't speak highly of his intelligence, but the fact that he figures it out now doesn't actually mean that he necessarily has a changed heart either. The actual Greek translates into something like, my father's slaves have plenty of loaves and I am perishing of famine. I'm not sure what's being expressed here isn't entitlement rather than repentance. His next actions are equally ambivalent. He rehearses his homecoming speech. The text does not indicate that he has a change of heart, only that he desires a change of circumstances, and that he has a clear plan to achieve this. He will go to his father and give a rehearsed speech that he can probably expect to work, given how far outside the boundaries of culturally expected norms his father has already gone for him. In fact, under the circumstances, he may even expect the father to react in the extravagant way he does. Refusing to hear the end of the speech, the father runs, which is in itself a rather undignified way of moving, particularly given his age and social status, runs to his son and immediately reinstates him. So far, we have a son who loves money and what luxuries it can bring him, to the extent that he abandons his father, his family, and his culture. When he runs out of money, he goes back to the source of money, where he is greeted with the trappings of status. Then, as we know, the fatted calf, the most expensive and luxurious animal on the farm, is killed to create a celebratory feast for this wayward son. All of this may simply look like a wonderfully forgiving father welcoming a wandering child back home, except that the father has more than one child, and the other child has been forgotten. The older son arrives home after a long day in the fields, possibly a long series of days in the fields. They didn't come home every night after work. Sometimes they slept out, if there were sheep, for example. But this has been a day, to a very large extent, like every other day before or after his younger brother left. The older son works steadily, obediently, willingly, and is forgotten. In the massive fuss over the clearly favored younger son, no one has even bothered to tell the older brother what has happened. No messenger has been sent, even perhaps to give him a half holiday in celebration. He has to ask a servant what the heck is going on. Let's be clear about this. In the joy that he is feeling for the return of his younger son, the father actually seems to forget he has another son. I don't think any of us can really condemn that older brother for his response. He's angry, and he refuses to join the celebration. He won't even acknowledge his brother, naming him "this son of yours" to his father. In his hurt and anger, he points out to his father that he has never even let him have a young goat to slaughter so that he can have a party with his friends. And now a fatted calf, the ultimate in festival food, so much more expensive than a kid would have been, has been killed to celebrate the return of a boy who has already squandered probably a third of the family's entire livelihood on himself. The father's response is interesting, to say the least. He says three things. You are always with me. Everything I have is yours. Well, we did have to have a party because your brother has been lost, presumed dead, and now is found. And we know him as alive. And this is where the story ends. We don't even hear the end of the argument. And believe me, if I had been that older son, there would have been more of an argument. If I had been that older son, the next words out of my mouth would have been pretty predictable if you know me, absolutely reasonable as far as I'm concerned, and rather pointed. Do I have to go away, misbehave, and or die before you show me that you love me? Yeah. Before you spend this kind of money on me? And in this context, it's a deeply appropriate question. It also gives rise to another question. Given this father's questionable parenting skills, obvious favoritism, not just upon the son's return, but upon his departure, and lousy memory, how can he possibly represent God? And my response is that he can't, and he isn't supposed to. I think this parable has been read in order to fulfill our desires, to see God in a certain way and ourselves in another, and in the process, we've missed the whole point. I was saying this morning to the group that is reading The Shadow of the Galilean together, like if we get to the end of the parable and somebody has been condemned, we probably read it wrong. And this parable is famous for condemning the older brother for his judgmentalism. I don't think he's being judgmental. I think he's being honest. So to get to the point of this, we need to go back further to understand the context in which Jesus is telling this story and the importance of the stories around it. Robert, I'm going to get you to just tap the computer's pad there because the screen's gone black and I'm not sure if it's still recording. Would you do that, please?
Sure.